And so it's our very, very great pleasure to have with us today Christophe Erismann, who is we have some similar interests in so far. We were just chatting about how I am doing part of the Eustratius commentary on the posterior analytics, and he sent me a note through academia thanking me for taking this on, and sent me one of his papers, which was very, very interesting. And so we thought that this would be a good opportunity for him to join us in our series of the Marquette Midwest Seminar in Ancient and Medieval Philosophy, where now that we're all getting more familiar with the technology here, we're able to bring in guests from far and wide, both to listen and to share their ideas. Christophe is Associate Professor of Byzantine Intellectual History at the University of Vienna, and he's also the chair of the Department of Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies there. From 2015 to 21, he led the European Research Council project Reassessing 9th Century Philosophy, a synchronic approach to the logical tradition. He's held positions at the universities of Cambridge, Helsinki, and Lausanne, where he taught medieval philosophy for several years as Swiss National Science Foundation professor. His research focuses on the reception of Greek logic, mainly Aristotle's categories and Porphyry's isagoge, and late ancient patristic and early medieval philosophy. He's published on the problem of universals, individuals, causality, and relation. He's the author of, and here my deficiencies in French will show, but I will. This is the name of his book, L'Homme commun, la jeunesse des réalismes ontologiques durant le Moyen Âge. And that's from 2011. So it's our very, very great privilege to have Christophe with us today. Welcome.
Thank you very much, both for the introduction, very kind introduction, and for the invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to discuss a few ideas with you, and I will take this opportunity to open a few questions related both to the chronology of Byzantine philosophy, to what Byzantine philosophy is, and to a special case of a change in argumentative method in Byzantium. So my 3 points for today will be the following. First, why do people change methods in philosophy? And I would like, it's impossible to answer now to the question in general, so I will focus on a very concrete case happening in 815. This case is interesting for us because it's well documented before, after, and we have a date to put on it. That's part of my more historical work to establish precisely this date. Today we will discuss more the ideas and the philosophical side of it, but we have with that a precise example where where people in Byzantium thought the solution and the method we had until now, a method which was based on John of Damascus and on the Pseudo-Dionysius, is not sufficient. We need something else, and they turned towards Aristotelian logic. When I say that it's well documented, it's because exactly on the same question, we have text written before, we have the context of the change, and we have the text written after it. So for the historian, I think it's a very interesting case to study, because this kind of question, why changes happened, is really interesting. Another case, indeed, where we can observe such a change in paradigm is in the 11th century, when people like Psellos, John Italos started to use Proclus as the main reference. And until now, I don't think we have a satisfactory explanation for this changes 11th century. But today I will discuss the other case, so this Aristotelian turn happening at the beginning of the 9th century. I will discuss the new method, indeed, so to see which components are used in it. So basically, it's what I call the relational explanation of images and its defense through logic. My point is more to focus on the logical aspect of the problem than of the theological aspect of the discussion. The discussion took place in the framework of iconoclasm, so about the debate was about the veneration of images in Byzantium, and there was a huge controversy. I will say a few words about that later. And it's in this framework that we can see this new method being used. And at the end, if there's still some time, I would like to discuss the question of the nature of Byzantine philosophy, which is, as you know, very much debated. And as for my first point, it's not possible to discuss it in general, so I will just stay with my particular case and see what we can conclude from it for a broader perspective of our inquiry about Byzantine philosophy. Just in case you're not familiar with Byzantine philosophy, there are several steps in the long history of Byzantine philosophy. The problem is that there is no scholarly agreement about when Byzantine philosophy started. You have several possibilities. If you open secondary literature, you will find different chronologies. I will now just sum up the possibilities in order also to show that my date of 815 is a kind of is an important date for the history of Byzantine philosophy. The first question is indeed what you do with the school of Alexandria. If you open books about Byzantine history, you will without problem find that Egypt in the 5th and 6th centuries is described as Byzantine. You have several books on Byzantine Egypt. And as you know, Alexandria is in Egypt, but you will find very little cases of articles or books saying that the School of Alexandria is part of the history of Byzantine philosophy. Partial explanation for that is because of the masters of the School of Alexandria were pagan, and there's this idea that Byzantine philosophy is related to Christianity, so that would change our representation of Byzantine philosophy. So that's the first difficulty. Then, as you know, 7th century, you have all the Arabic conquests, and the Byzantine Empire is deprived of more or less half of its territories. And for us, what is more interesting is that the empire is deprived of many intellectual centers, schools, and monasteries. So to take an American example, it's a bit like if you look at a map of the US, and you take all the East Coast away, and you're just staying with half of your well, I will not say empire of the country, and then you have to find a solution to reconstruct the structures and so on. That's why this period is from time to time described as a dark age for Byzantium. It's also because if you lose more or less all your scholarly structures, it takes time to reconstruct. Then 7th, 8th century, it's an interesting period also for the definition of Byzantine philosophy, because more or less all the texts we have, serious texts we have in philosophy and theology, are written in Sinai, Syria, the old Palestine, so Jerusalem, the monastery of Marsaba, and so on. That is precisely outside the borders of the empire. So in fact, you have Byzantium on the one hand and Byzantine philosophy being done outside of the empire, which is also something interesting if you consider the identity of the thinkers. And now there is more and more reflection, thought given to the fact that we should not only consider these thinkers as Byzantine, but also as members of local communities. The case, the most famous case being John of Damascus. And now there is a trend considering him more than like an Umayyad Christ, more than like Byzantine. This period is more a time of compendia, list of definitions, so it's also a time of compilation of knowledge. Then 726 until 843, we have what we called iconoclasm. It's the term itself is quite problematic, but let's have it as a chrononym, so as a name for the period. And here the debate is about images and veneration of these images, and about the possibility to depict Christ, Mary, the saints, and this is a very long and fascinating debate to study. And our question today finds place in this debate. The 9th century is a fascinating century to study, because you can observe both a return to the original text, to the original sources, mainly Aristotle, and not people are not working like before on compendia and second-hand literature. That's the century during which a lot of our important manuscripts of ancient Greek text were copied. So it's an important period also for the transmission of texts. The 10th century is relatively quiet, and then with the 11th century onwards, you can see the succession of a generation of great masters, Psellos, Italos, and Eustratius. The story is then interrupted, as you know, in 1204 with the Fourth Crusade and the conquest of Constantinople. This is an important interruption of a tradition of study. Then it started again later, but with a completely different intellectual context, also because after the Latin presence in the region, you can see the first translation in Greek of Boëtius, Augustine, Aquinas. So the philosophical agenda is different. So just to summarize my point about when does Byzantine philosophy begin, we have several solutions. Here I just listed 3 of them. So if you consider the School of Alexandria to be part of the history of Byzantine philosophy, then a date like 395 and the partition of the Roman Empire is a good date. If you don't want Alexandria, but you want the production, the literary production of the Levant, so then you can consider 642, which is the loss of Alexandria, as a starting date. Or you can say Byzantium is more or less focused on Constantinople, and we'd like to take as a starting point the renewal of interest in philosophy happening in Constantinople during the 9th century, and then I think that 815 is a good solution for such a comprehension of the history of Byzantine philosophy. I don't have an answer for this question. For me, the three solutions have pros and cons, but I think it's important to be aware of this precise difficulty. Iconoclasm, as you know, is a debate between iconoclasts, so literally image breakers, and iconophiles or iconodules, so people who believed that we can make representations and that the veneration of these images is a good thing. It was introduced as a policy by Leo III in 726. And for him, it was a very, at the beginning, it was a relatively simple idea that icon veneration is idolatry. And his position was based, as you can guess, on the Old Testament and all the interdiction of producing idols that you can find in the Old Testament. Things change a bit later with Constantine V, so the son of Leo III, because Constantine gave to the debate a Christological dimension. We can discuss about what the reason for such a change. It's probably linked to the fact that Constantine wanted to organize a council on images, and normally you do councils on big questions, normally related to Trinity or to Christology. So it was important to have a kind of Christological dimension. Part of the discussion at the time is about the two natures of Christ, the divine and the human. And for the iconoclast argument, the position is to say, well, as Christ is divine, it's not possible to depict him. And the iconophile answer is to say, well, as he's human, it's possible to depict him. And if you don't accept that he's depictable, you're not accepting the incarnation. 787, iconophily was restored at the Second Council of Nicaea for a very brief amount of time, and in 814, 815, the Emperor Leo V re-implemented iconoclasm as the official policy for Byzantium. That's the start of what we called the second iconoclasm, and that's what we will discuss tonight. So 815, reintroduction of iconoclasm, and that's the starting point for us. Why? Because the iconophile theologians have to find an answer to that. And there is a clear feeling that the previous conceptual model based on John of Damascus and on Pseudo-Dionysius was insufficient. And more or less, it was inadequate to prevent the reappearance of iconoclasm. So you need something new. And now you have two important figures. One was Patriarch of Constantinople, so the highest function of the church until 815, that's Nicephorus. And the second is the Egumenon, so the leader of one of the most important monasteries of Constantinople, that's Theodos Tudites. And what is interesting for us is that these two persons who are not particularly friends, to say the least, there is a long and complex relationship between the two, adopt simultaneously a new method for defending images based on Aristotelian logic. So here we have a change in paradigm. So we don't use the conceptuality of the corpus Dionysiacum and this idea that visible things are images of invisible realities, or that through images you can understand something of the intelligible. and you don't use so much John of Damascus, who had a very good logical culture, but surprisingly, he did not use it in the case of the discussion of images. So just a point here again on chronology. I will not discuss that, but we have to revise the standards chronology, because in a fantastic book on Nicephorus, Paul Alexander considered that this use of Aristotelian logic already started in the aftermath of the Second Council of Nicaea, so at the end of the 8th century, based on two texts. The thing is that now we have completely different datation for these two texts, and we can revise his chronology. And it's important to do that because thanks to that, the sequence of events is really more make more sense. Because with the model of Paul Alexander, you have at an undetermined time the appearance of this new methodology, which he calls scholastic. I don't like this appellation because I think it's not a good thing here to make a reference to the Latin tradition. And in addition to that, scholastic for me really implies the idea of a strong structure like a school or a university, and we don't have that at the time in Constantinople. And in his narrative, Theodore and Nicephorus are just followers of an already invented or established method. And this is problematic because first, you don't know who is the inventor or the first one to use this method, and it's a bit strange to have someone without name but such an excellent education, and it's a small world at the time, Constantinople. So it's a bit strange that we have absolutely no indication about such a person. But if we adopt the revised chronology, then things are completely clear. 815, the emperor adopted iconoclasm again, and then as a reaction to this decision, the leaders of the iconophile camp decided to work together to establish a new defense of icons based on Aristotle. And here, in that case, it makes sense that to consider Nicephorus and Theodore as the persons, the initiators of this new method, because we know that both are absolutely well educated. This generation received a very good education, also in logic, so it makes perfectly sense. Then now we can move to the ideas and the content of this method. I think it has three components. The first is the integration of philosophical concepts. We will discuss them later. The relatives, so the prosti, so one of the categories from Aristotle, and homonymy. So the homonymy is the idea that two things have the same name but do not share the same essence. That's also something coming from the beginning of the categories. And the first part of the work is to explain what an icon or what an image is, thanks to these two concepts. But what I'd like to claim today is that the method is larger than this in its scope, because it also includes the use of logical reasoning and what is called in Greek syllogismoi, so syllogisms, but you should not here have a representation of this syllogism as being perfect Aristotelian syllogisms. It's more kind of deductive reasoning, and they are less technical, and we will discuss that also later, than what Aristotle expects from syllogisms. They are used positively to prove the position, and in a very strange way, that the Byzantines like to pile up arguments. So it's not enough to give one argument or to give two for proving something. If you can put 10 arguments or 15 arguments on the table, it's better. So we have in some text lists of arguments, and what is interesting is that if you look at the manuscript, sometimes this list of arguments will circulate and be copied independently of the rest of the text, so probably to be used in school as an exercise for teaching logic. Logical reasoning is also used to refute the opponent's position and to show its absurdity. The last component, and that's also something interesting, is the accusation of ignorance of logic. So it's something you find often in the text. You try to present your opponent as someone without education. But not only without education in general, but precisely without education in logic. So what is interesting here is that you see that what was at the beginning a question of theology is transformed into a more philosophical inquiry. Just to explain how the solution works, you take one example, which is a saint and an image of the saint. So here, my example is probably a bit anachronistic because that's Gregory Palamas, if I'm not mistaken. But so later figure, but it's not the guy himself who is important, but the situation. So you have what they called the model or the pattern. So that's the saint himself, and you have a representation of this saint, and the question will be, how do you understand the relation and the ontological status of these two entities? First element of answer is to present them as Aristotelian prosody. So you say that in both items you have one relational property. In the model, it's the property of being the model of, and in the image, it's the property of being the image of. And it's analyzed exactly like you would analyze the relation between a father and a son, a master and a slave, a professor and a student. And they are very precise in the use of prosody because they introduce two things. The first one is ontological simultaneity. So you can't have one item without having the second if they are relatives. This does not mean that you need both subjects at the same time. It's just that you need both relatives at the same time. So, for example, the person who will be depicted surely exists before the depiction, but it's not at the time a model. It starts to be a model only when the image is made of him. And that's why you can speak of an ontological simultaneity in the sense of Aristotle. And they also adopt the second characteristic of prosody according to Aristotle, which is the simultaneity of knowledge. So if you know one of the prosody, you necessarily know the second. And this is also something interesting for them, because you will find in Byzantine literature a lot of stories about people dreaming and seeing a saint, for example, in their dream, and then going to the church and seeing the icon. And the icon is a way to recognize the saints and so on. So this question of simultaneity of knowledge is also used for that. What is interesting for us is that this level of prosody is not enough. They add to this the fact that there is a relation, a skesis between the two items. Why is that interesting? It's because the notion of skesis is not Aristotelian. That's something you find only in the commentators of Aristotle, mainly in the Alexandrian commentators. And you can see, for example, in Nicephorus, he would say, the image is related to the pattern and is the effect of a cause. Therefore, necessarily, it belongs to and is called a relative, ton prosody. Relatives are said to be such as they are from their being of some other thing. That's a direct quote from Aristotle. And through their relation, skesei, they are mutual correlatives. A father, for instance, is called the son's father. Thus, a pattern is called the pattern of an image, and an image the image of a pattern. And nobody will call the image of an individual an unrelated image. For the one and the other are introduced and contemplated together. If you look at the Greek, that's always ama for this idea of simultaneity. Okay, so prosody is the first concept. The second is homonymy. And here it's also something interesting in the sense that what is important is that the name is the same. And that you can say, for example, of an image or an icon, that the name is Gregory or Petros or what do you want? So the name is the same for the model and for the image. But what is also very important, and there is a long story behind this. I will not discuss that now. We can discuss that in the discussion if you want, about the difference of essence. And indeed, the essence of the image is different. That's an artifact made of wood with colors, maybe some gold. And it's inanimate, it's not rational, it's not mortal, and so on. And on the contrary, you have the model with a rational animal, mortal, capable of understanding and knowing. So homonyms are used here for exactly to describe this situation. One example by Nicephorus again. Moreover, the resemblance confers homonymy on the icon and its archetype, so its model. The designation, prosegoria, is one and the same for both the icon and the archetype. The icon of the king is called the king, and might well say, the king and I are one, despite the evident fact that they are different in essence. We have said these things in order to demonstrate the way in which the image, which is considered together with the archetype, is related to it. You find exactly the same idea in Theodore the Studite. For relation, as they say, belongs to the relatives, for they both, i.e. the model and the image, exist together with one another, and convert with respect to one another as archetype to image. For the one could not exist if the other were not present, as has been philosophized, also in the case of things that exist at the same time. There is added as well the word homonyms, and this word to is of the same meaning. For a name is a name of something that is named. Thus, in this case too, the reasoning belongs to the prosody, since according to the definition used in philosophy, we are taught that homonyms are things which have only the name in common, while the statement of essence, logos thesousias, that corresponds with the name is different. That's a quote of Aristotle, such as Christ himself and Christ when he has been depicted. So you can see how the concepts are used, but as I said, the use of concept is just one part of the new method. Here, an example of an argument is just one argument out of 10. So I said at the beginning that they like lists of arguments, and here it's just one out of a long list of arguments. And the point that Nicephorus would like to make is that the icon of Christ he's superior in dignity to in comparison with the cross. The cross is a traditional religious symbol of the iconoclasts because they don't like figurative representation. So if to have a an example for that, you can just think at the church of Hagia Irene in Constantinople, where the mosaic is just a depiction of a very big cross. And the discussion of Nicephorus is to show that the icon is superior to the cross. And for this, he used also some logical concept. I would probably not discuss that argument in detail because for the sake of time, but was to give you an example. We find something very interesting in Serdor about reasoning, and that's something I'd like just to mention now. To show you the kind of logical culture that these people have. We're speaking of two people who are not professional philosophers, who are more involved in the church, who are theologians. One was the Patriarch of Constantinople, the second is the head of a very large monastery. But as you can see, their logical education was really good. And here, an interesting text by Serdor about arguments. I hope to destroy the foreign opinion of the iconoclasts, even if the attempt might be behind my strength. To support my argument, I will make use of a number of syllogisms. They will lack the skilled construction, ploken, according to the Aristotelian technique, which may result in nonsense. Rather, my syllogisms will resort to a plain form of expression, relying on the strength of the truth. When we read such a text for the first time, we can think, well, he's taking some distance from Aristotle, and the expression then Aristotelian technologian is an old patristic expression used against Eunomius. Is it by Gregory of Nyssa or Basil of Caesarea? But it's a way to criticize the use of logic. But I think that the point of Serdor here is more interesting than that. He's very happy to use Aristotle. So here I think that his point is a bit different. His point is to say, well, there is a difference in Aristotle between the validity, the formal validity of a syllogism and the truth of the syllogism, so the truth of the conclusion. And his point here is to say, well, I'm not looking for arguments which are formally perfect, but I'm looking for reasonings reasoning which will bring the truth. So reasoning, the premises of which are true. And I think that such a remark directly shows that the logical culture of Theodore was was very good. So that's the second point, the use of argument. And the third and last point is the the accusation of ignorance. And for example, here we have an example, once again by Nicephorus. And he's speaking of the Emperor Constantine V, who is dead at the time, but Constantine was a very clever emperor. He had an excellent education and was very interested in theology, and is one of the few people who really tried to give an intellectual coherence to iconoclasm. And therefore, Nicephorus was still trying to answer to the position of Constantine. And one part of the answer is that Constantine has no good education or good knowledge of logic. The man, therefore, does not possess the slightest spark of piety, nor can he boast the least bit of knowledge of logic. From where, indeed, will he be able to support an account of that which causes and that which is caused, or that of the comparison of what is similar, or how he be able to discern that which itself participates in something from that which something else participates in, or otherness from difference? For all these distinctions can naturally be observed in the case of the archetype and the icon, since some indicate us the relation and the quality that is in them, two terms from the categories of Aristotle, while others indicate to us the otherness of the subject. So here it's interesting to see that they added this dimension to the argumentation. So if we want to speak of a change in methods, it's important to say that the new method was, at least for a period, influential. And I think that in that case, it was really influential, because if you look at some later polemics, mainly religious polemics, you will see exactly the same methods used by people like Photius when he argues against the Franks, against the Filioque, so against the procession of the Holy Spirit. And we find that also in the text of Nicetas of Byzantium when he writes about Islam. Indeed, there was, before the 9th century, some cases of use of logic in, for example, in Christological controversies. I consider this method to be new due to the technicality of the concept and the massive use of logic, of argumentation, and also due to this accusation of being not knowing logic properly, and this valorization of logic, because, as you know, the status of logic was not always positive in the history of the church, because for a long period the use of logic in theology was perceived as a way to create heresies. So here I think we have something interesting in the positive valuation of logic and in the way it is used. So later in the 9th century with Photius and Nicetas, we have example of this use of logic. I think it will continue in different forms. you see in the 11th century people continuing to use logic in theology, but then it will start to be criticized. Psellos will have to defend himself about the use of logic. He does that in a fantastic text, a letter to Xiphilinos, where he explains his method and why logic has to be used. And his student and a successor at the school, John Italos, will also use logic, but will be condemned for that. And I just quote here the text of the condemnation of John Italos. To them who attempt by whatever means to introduce a new controversy or teaching into the ineffable economy of our incarnate Savior and God, and who seek to penetrate the way wherein God the Word was united to the human substance, and for what reason he deified the flesh he assumed, and who by using dialectical terminology about nature and adoption try to dispute about the transcendent innovation of his divine and human natures, anathema. So condemnation of John Italos for various reasons, also politics, but one of the reasons is his use of logic. And a great Byzantinist, Paul Magdaleno, suggested that this condemnation of John Italos is a kind of turning point for Byzantium, and that's the point at which Byzantium renounces to develop the scholastic method, which in the West will contribute to the scientific revolution. And that's probably very, very true. You can still see after John Italos, like in Eustratius, an interest for logic. He wrote commentaries. There are people in Marquette who are the expert on that, and but the method for doing theology will be less and less used in that way, to one exception, and that's something also interesting, the literature about the filioque. There you still find from time to quite regularly the use of logical arguments, but other that it stops. I just go to my conclusion. What does the emergence of this argumentative method tell us about the nature of Byzantine philosophy? I think there are 2 or 3 points to conclude from this study. The first is that when you look at Byzantine text, we should stay really open-minded. What I mean with that is that it's not enough to write the history of Byzantine philosophy with focusing only on commentaries on Aristotle. Why? Because they are giving a very interesting image of Byzantium, but they are inscribed in a tradition. And from time to time, to consider applied logic, for example, will give you some more personal example, will give you a more vivid representation of what logic was in Byzantium, because these people were really part of a controversy which can have some existential implication, because some of the people during the time of iconoclasm suffer really in their body of the controversy, where in prison or had really to suffer for that. So this kind of debate have an existential importance, which gives, I have the impression, an additional level of sense to their use of logic, and show exactly what they decided to use and to integrate in their own thought. So I think it's important to study, for example, in the case of logic, all the scholarly material, so the glosses you can find in manuscripts, commentaries, paraphrases, compendia, but also all the controversies in which logic is used. Then it leads me to my final question. What is the status of applied logic? Is applied logic really philosophy? In the sense that when the primary question, for example, is theological, but you use logic to answer to it. What's the status of the text you're writing? Should we call that theology and ignore it when we write a history of Byzantine philosophy? Or should we say if the text shows a deep knowledge of philosophy, the use of philosophy, I think then it makes sense to integrate them in our corpus of texts to be studied. Indeed, applied logic is maybe less prestigious as the real logic, or when you try to write a text about a logical problem, to solve a logical problem. But I would say this kind of literature tells us a lot about the society, about the logical culture of the time, and in some cases about the logical questions themselves. Because, for example, here we can see very interesting ideas about the resemblance and homonymy, and the fact that both are going together, and that the homonymy is grounded in the resemblance and things like this, which I think are really interesting to discuss from a philosophical point of view. So it was my remarks for today to say, well, if you want to have a good representation of what Byzantine philosophy was, I think it's a good idea also to look at theology, to look at medicine. We have very interesting texts by persons interested in medicine who use also logic. Melesius the monk, for example, is a good example of that. You find that in law texts. You find that in various kind of literature. Why? Because the logic was a part of the education for the high for the society in Constantinople, and you don't forget it. So I mean, it was part of your education, and then later when you have a problem to solve, it's something you still have in your mind, and maybe you will need to go back to the text to make a precise quote, but it's something which is present and which you may use in different contexts. And I think that this different context will tell you a lot about the reality of philosophy and logic in Constantinople during the Middle Ages. Thank you so much.
Thank you. There is a raise hand feature up at the top bar for those who have questions. So I believe that there we go. Joe goes first, and I'll raise my hand too. Joe.
Thank you very much. A wonderful paper. I was wondering, with regard to John Damascene, there was a book published, I think, in the late 60s on his logic. I mean, it was an edition of two texts, the Dialectica and the Institutio, I think, Elementaris, was it?
Exactly.
So, and I was quite surprised when I first looked at this, because it was so thoroughly Aristotelian, and as opposed to glancing through the church fathers, I didn't find that kind of intensity. And even comparing to someone like Augustine in the Latin tradition, who seems to have very, very vague familiarity with Aristotle, the Damascene text was really quite impressive. So my question is, was he or his text at the base of some of the, so to speak, revival and interest, or the beginning of the real interest in logic that took place later that you were describing in your paper?
Well, that's an excellent question. Thank you very much. A few remarks and then the answer. You're completely right about the two texts. They are well informed in Aristotelian logic, even if now we are attempting to think that John of Damascus never had the text of Aristotle in front of him, and that he worked with previous compendia of Aristotelian logic, and that the Dialectica is a reworking on this kind of material with some additions from the commentaries from Alexandria and so on. About his importance in the debate, what is surprising is that John wrote 3 defenses of images, but without using the logic, and he had a very good knowledge of logic, but he didn't apply it to the problem. What you can find in his text about images is a traditional Alexandrian way to approach things. That is, what is an image? What's the function of an image? And all these traditional questions you ask in Alexandrian in the Kephalaia of Alexandrian commentaries. And to come to your question, John was quoted in at the councils as an authority for images. What is absolutely possible is that his logical work was used later for the work done by people like Nicephorus. Why? Because we know that at the beginning of the 9th century, you have several people moving from Palestine to Constantinople due to the situation in Palestine, notably people from Masaba were not able to stay there. And we know that, for example, in 813, we have an important move of Michael Sinkelos and other people to Constantinople, and they probably brought manuscripts with them. So it's really possible. Well, we know that this move of people happened 2 years before the period we are discussing now. That they're coming from a monastery to which John of Damascus was associated with, so that it's really possible to think that they brought to Constantinople the text of John of Damascus, and that it was in reading John that someone has the idea to say, well, here we find things we can use for images. On the other hand, you know, there are various other possible explanations. First, the beginning of the categories. If you just open the text, it's about also an image. It's about the depicted man. So it's not completely unrelated to the image. You find in John Philoponus a discussion about the king and the portrait of the king. And these people in Constantinople at the time had a fantastic access to text. So you had in Constantinople the ancient commentators, you had the complete text of Aristotle, you had an entire philosophical tradition. So exactly what was the reason for thinking, okay, that's exactly how we should defend our position. Is difficult, but John of Damascus is definitely a possibility, precisely because we have testimonies about this move from people from the monastery of Saint Saba, which is not far away from Jerusalem, to Constantinople, and we have good reasons to believe that it was exactly at the time that the writings of John of Damascus arrived to Constantinople, and it may be a good explanation, because if you start reading these kind of things, it's quite normal to start thinking, okay, maybe it can be useful, because as I said, the discussion in the categories is linked to images, and you also have some discussions about homonymy which are related to images. So the gap was not too big. What is just surprising is that John did not use logic to defend images, but maybe he was indirectly the cause for that. That's really a possibility.
Thank you. I do have a couple of others, but I don't want to, so maybe you could get back to me later if there's enough time. Thank you.
Well, I suggest that you just raise your hand, and you'll be in the line. But I think it's Paolo who is next.
Thanks so much, Christophe, for your talk. Thank you, Owen, for organizing. My question is about the other two aspects of the method that you mentioned. I mean, the first was the integration of philosophical concepts such as relatives and homonymy, which you developed in your exposition, showing that they stem from the categories. And about the other two, my question is the following, namely the use of syllogismos and the accusation of ignorance. You mentioned that you gave us that passage from Theodore's on Arguments about the use of syllogismos to see lacking ploken kataten Aristotelian technology, right? But I was wondering what exactly he means by syllogismos in that context, because Aristotle calls different kinds of inferences syllogismos, not only those from the prior analytics, those which we call syllogisms, but also those from the topics and sophistical refutations, which are dialectical and sophistical inferences, and also rhetorical inferences in the rhetoric. And the use of logical reasoning to both prove an aspect of their position and to reduce the opponent's position to absurdity, as you phrased it, and also the accusation of ignorance suggests to me a dialectical context, right, such that the topics and the sophistical refutations would be more prominent here than the analytics. Right, but what I find intriguing about that is that we don't have, at least we don't know of, commentaries on the topics and the sophistical refutations prior to the 9th century, except the commentary by Alexander on the topics. And a notice that we have that Alexander may have written a commentary on the sophistical refutations, which is no longer extant, right? Whereas commentaries on the prior analytics are common from the early 3rd to the 2nd half of the 6th century. We have commentaries by Alexander, Themistius, Ammonius, and Philoponus. And in the 11th century, when Michael of Ephesus writes a commentary on the sophistical refutations, and John Nicholas writes a commentary on the topics, at least in the case of Michael of Ephesus, the idea is that his commentaries are meant to supplement commentaries on Aristotle's works, which were not available at the time. So do we have evidence that the topics and the sophistical refutations were discussed in 9th century Byzantine Empire, and especially in that connection to theological arguments?
Well, thank you. That's an excellent question. The case of the two texts is a bit different, just for one reason. In the case of the Sophistici Elenchi, we have a fragment of an old manuscript of Aristotle in majuscule. And that's our only example of, that's just two leaves which were used as a cover for another manuscript, but they are preserved, and due to the chronology we now knew about the change from the majuscule to the minuscule, we know that we can date it more or less, because there's still discussion. I mean, I've asked several friends who are expert in paleography, and the question of the datation of this fragment is still discussed, because it could be as early as 780 and could be as late as 850. But at least if you think that in order to have a copy, you need a model, not to make a joke, but it means that the text was there and what was circulating. And if you know the price of manuscripts, you don't copy things if you're not interested, because the pergament is expensive, the time of the scribe is expensive, so you don't copy things which you don't consider to be important. So I would consider that as a weak proof that there was at least some interest for the sophistical refutation. The question of about the topics is really difficult, because you're completely right in saying that this would be the natural context for this relation to arguments, but I don't think that we have well, I'm maybe wrong, but I can't quote a single mention of it in the 9th century. And what you see if you look at what we have of as evidence for the teaching of logic, and that's the Amphilochia of Photius. And there you can see that he devoted one to the Isagoge, the 77, and 10 to the categories, but nothing more. Then, well, I say that in front of Richard Taylor, who can probably speak better than I about this. But at the time, there was also this question of a short organon and stopping exactly as you said that after the first analytics, because maybe I think that Farabi says that it could be dangerous for a religion to continue the study of the organon, because with that you start to doubt about things, and that the Christians are not don't study this part of the organon. I don't know if it's true or not. What is, I think, relatively clear is that the basic teaching of logic was until the first analytics. You see that in John of Damascus. You see that in some compendia, probably also in other texts. And the rest would be probably for a more advanced study. only, maybe not only, but one interesting document for to answering your question is the life of Nicephorus. Because in the life of Nicephorus, which is an hagiographical text written later, by someone who, and that's funny, was himself an iconoclast before turning back to iconophily, Ignatius the Deacon. In the biography, Ignatius devotes 2 or 3 pages to the logical education of Nicephorus. And there you really have the impression, thanks to the description, that he had access to the entire organon. The question is, given the fact that the life is written a few decades later, when Ignatius speaks of logical education, is he describing the content of the logical education of his time or of the time of Nicephorus? And this is a bit hard to reach a conclusion, a definitive conclusion on that, because, well, the text gives us the impression that Nicephorus had really an encyclopedic knowledge of logic. Definitely part of it is true, because if you read the writings of Nicephorus, you will find several logical concepts or arguments. How far can we go about the topic is a question I think it's better to leave open. And the one last remark, we also have from the beginning of the 11th century a text called the Anonymous von Heiberg, and that's the notes of probably a professor. That was a class on the quadrivium, but there is also a section on logic. I try to remember if the topics are discussed there, and that's something I need to check. But maybe that would be interesting to see there if one finds some. The syllogisms are definitely discussed, but I'm not sure if we can really be sure that some material from the topics is discussed there. But you're absolutely right. It's a kind of black spot in the history. Porphyry is everywhere. The categories are everywhere. Also because there is a tradition for that. I mean, the entire patristic time is makes use of this kind of concepts, because when you say that the Trinity is one ousia, then you start with that, and the 2 natures of Christ. Christology is really a reflection about a relation between one individual and his 2 natures, and that's exactly the kind of things for which Porphyry is very very useful. But now for the topic, to the best of my knowledge, there's no clear testimony.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. If I could step in a bit, if I understand you, the iconophile arguments that were appealing to the relationship of being an image and to the whole notion of a pros T, the whole point there was to say that there are 2 things, and psychologically, by looking at the one, we can better venerate the other, but there is the relationship there. The fact that we're dealing with the relationship of the pros T means that the one thing is not the other, so I am not venerating the object. But I'm wondering if that distinction might not cut both ways, because if you think about the Neoplatonic context that they would have been working from, For someone like Plotinus, at any rate, the relationship of pros T is going to be the relationship between the mover and the moved. It's going to be the relationship between the active and the passive. And so on an emanationist scheme, the ontological divide between, say, equivocals, between the form and that which participates in the form, there are not sharp divisions there. And that kind of thinking after Plotinus led to the defense of theurgy with Iamblichus and people like that, that one might have an object that has transcendent power because of the relationship between participant and that in which is participating. So presumably those who have a rather robust form of veneration where they believe that the object actually has some kind of holiness within it and is not simply something to help remind us of the source, you could use these same kinds of logical distinctions to defend that. Now, I realize we don't have iconoclast writings because most of them have been destroyed, but presumably the iconoclasts could use these very distinctions to say, according to the philosophical views that you are working from, the participant has the cause in it. And I was just wondering if there's any hint of that kind of dialectic going on. I don't know these texts at all.
That's a fascinating question on several levels, because first, a more general comment, with that, you're touching to the most difficult part of the job for the iconophiles, is just to be sure they are not considered as idolatrous. Because it's very difficult to say, well, I venerate the icon, but I'm just venerating the depicted person and not the object. And that's something you can that's really a problem for them since the 7th century and all we have a fascinating set of texts from controversies between the Jews and the Christians about the veneration of images already in the 7th century, and there you find very interesting example of people saying, you should really understand we are not venerating the matter. For example, if you take two pieces of wood and you make the cross, I will venerate it. But as soon as you take them away, I could put them in the fire. And the same, you will see the same for an icon. As long as you can see the depiction of the icon on the piece of wood, you can venerate it. If the image is not clearly visible, also you can put it away. And that was really a very important question for them, to take some distance from this accusation of being idolatrous. And then the question you mentioned about theurgy and agalmata, that's absolutely fascinating, because for a reason which is not for me entirely clear, as you know, we don't have religious Byzantine statues. We don't have three-dimensional representations of Christ, the saints, Mary, as we have in the West. You go in a Gothic medieval church in the West, it's full of statues, wooden statues, and that was not a problem. In Byzantium, it was impossible to make a statue, because this one was a kind of pagan habit, and I think exactly for the reason you mentioned. It's because they had all this pagan literature about theurgy in mind, and it was necessary to make some distance between themselves and the pagans. And for this reason, you will not find statues in Byzantium, which is really interesting, because you have these people who are iconophile, and they defend depictions, but hardly, not hardly, with the greatest energy, but they will defend only two-dimensional representations, icons, mosaics, frescoes, what you want, but nothing with three dimensions. And that's a very interesting question, to know what's the problem with the third dimension. Why is fundamentally a representation in 3 dimensions so different from a two-dimensional representation? And well, one element of explanation is to say, okay, it's because it's too close to the pagan practice. The second, it's more exegetical, that it's a way for them to find a kind of solution for what is written in the Old Testament, and this idea that God says you should not make. And then the question is, what should you not make? And the Greek of the Septuaginta say glypta, and glypta, that's really the statues in the and that's interesting, because with that you're changing a bit the problem, right? And maybe they were on that line to say, okay, we respect the interdiction of idols from the Old Testament because we don't do statues, but our 2 dimensions images are not concerned by this. This is just something quite hypothetical, but it's really interesting as a question, because why would the third dimension be such a problem? And I mean, it's really not a matter of 1 or 2 cases. We have only one religious status from Byzantium. It's a 10th century virgin now in Victoria and Albert Museum, but I don't know where it was made, and maybe at the kind of border region or in south of Italy. Or I don't know the story of that object precisely, but it's absolutely clear you don't have statues. In the West, it's a bit different, because they started at the beginning to put relics in it, which is exactly what you're saying with having something inside, and in that case you can say, well, I'm not venerating the statue, I'm venerating the relic in it. And the story with statues started like this, with relics in it, but that's something you don't. It's a practice you don't find in the East. And about, yeah, you're completely right about what you said, that the kind of Neoplatonism could be a very interesting conceptual framework for them. My impression is that it would be a bit too perceived as maybe as a bit too pagan, as a kind of conceptuality, because it would come from people who were not exactly on the line. And even if Porphyry is an authority for logic, is also thanks to due to the fact that it was anonymized in several cases. You just say, here is the teaching, the logical teaching, or in most of the cases, you have a very interesting phenomenon, which is that you take texts and logical text, and you put the name of Maximus the Confessor on them, and you have a pseudo-epigraphical attribution to a great name of the church, and there after that you can use the text, because, well, it's Maximus the Confessor. So then you can you can use that. And what is interesting is that you have exactly the same phenomenon in the West. You have an anonymous treatise on the categories called the De Categoriae Decem, which was attributed to Augustine. Probably also because if you put the name of a saint on it, it's less problematic to use it. And here you, so just to say that the image of Porphyry was probably a bit ambiguous, because Porphyry, as you know, wrote also treatises against the Christians. So, and Iamblichus was probably not very palatable to theologians, because it's a kind of figures which is more associated with an active with Neoplatonism, which defends pagan religion more actively, like the people in Athens. So, yeah,
it's such a shame that we don't have the iconoclast texts, because we might have seen some of these implications drawn out. We said that we would leave around now. I know that it's getting late for you, but we can certainly take a couple more questions if people are agreeable.
I'm very happy to continue the discussion. And may I just add something to your last remark? Because it would also be interesting for the question of logic, because with that it would be possible to see if the use of logic in that discussion is only something done by the iconophiles, or if the iconoclasts also used logic. And my impression is the image wave of iconoclast is a bit false, because first we only have all this iconophile literature, which is from time to time also something like propaganda. So you also have a bit of well, you can't take everything as a good historical source. But there is one funny story with one of the great iconoclasts, John the Grammarian. He was in the 9th century patriarch of Constantinople, the last iconoclast patriarch. And we just have 3 quotes of him in an anonymous refutation. And one of the first editor of these quotes made a mistake in the edition of one of these fragments, because John is giving the traditional Aristotelian definition of man, of human being, and he starts with zoon, as zoon, neton, and so on, and the editor read toon, and then you have 30 years of secondary literature saying that you can see from that that the iconoclasts have no logical culture, because they don't even know something as basic as the definition of human being according to Aristotle, and they start saying that, well, a human being is a being, blah blah blah. And if there's just one manuscript in Madrid, but if you look at it, it's absolutely clear. It's written zoon. But due to just one error, and we all made errors, so I'm not blaming the editor, just saying it's a shame that it happened exactly there, because thanks to that, you will read very often that the iconoclasts have no good education in logic, which I don't think is true. I don't think that the education of iconoclasts was less good than the education of the other people. Maybe the first iconoclast, so Leo III, was really a soldier, someone coming from the military world, was not very interested in theology and in logic. Okay, but already with his son, you start to have people with really an excellent intellectual background. And I don't think that we should have an image of the iconoclasts as barbarians without education and just destroying images. And they are, for a lot of them, they are excellently educated. They started great reforms in Byzantium, and well, we should be careful with the sources. But
thank you. Joe, you said you had a follow-up.
Yes, thank you very much. This was a question that arose out of a paper I heard earlier on Leon of Byzantium, and I was surprised to see too the level of, so to speak, scholasticism, or at least Aristotelianism that is in his work. But the one issue that came out of that paper I heard was, and you of course pointed this out, that Aristotle doesn't use the word skesis for relation. And I mean, there might be a couple of instances in I think the biological works, but in any event, that's true. But I'm wondering, since I'm not familiar with the commentary tradition that well, is there a distinction made such that the skesis would stand for what we would say in Latin as the relatio, the relation itself, and then the prosti, the ton prosti, or the ta prosti, those are the terms of the relation? Is that distinction held, or is it
no,
is it a looser terminology?
The Latin terminology, the prosti are the ad aliquid.
Mm-hmm.
And skesis is relatio, but the prosti are, maybe you find from time to time relativa or something like this. But well, it's not false to say that there are the terms of the relations, but the problem, if you think at a relation, let's take an example. Two friends, Owen and Christophe, and there is a relation of friendship between the two. What are the terms of the relation? Is that Owen, or is that the property of friendship with Christophe in Owen? Depending on your answer, I will say yes or no. And the problem is that there's not just one explanation in Latin, because it's a long debate, and you have a fantastic. I worked on that in my previous life when I was doing more Latin medieval philosophy. You have in the 12th century people who thought that as soon as you have a new personal relation with someone, you gain a new prosti. So, for example, if you're the father of 3 kids, you don't have only one property of paternitas, but you have as much properties of paternitas as you have kids. If it's paternity, that's fine. But if you think at resemblance, if in the morning I tie, I wear a white shirt, thanks to that, I'm resemblant to all the people in the world wearing a white shirt. And if you think that for every single relation, you have one property, at the end, it's a matter of millions. And It's a difficult it's a difficult point. You're completely right that there are one or two occurrences of scasis in the biological writings, but I think in a very different sense. It means something else there. And the first one to use scasis in the sense of relation, I think, is Alexander of Aphrodisias. And then it starts to be quite common, and you find a lot of that in Simplicius and in other logical commentaries. It's interesting for us just because it shows that the Byzantines are working with Aristotle, but also with the commentators, and that the link between Alexandria and Constantinople is an important one.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much.
Paolo, did you have a follow-up? Or is there a hand from before?
No, I think it's my hand from before. Sorry.
Okay. Well, in that case, let me give Christophe our heartiest thanks for a very, very interesting and intriguing presentation on something that I, for one, don't know much about, but I'm very eager to learn more. So you've whet my appetite, and probably that of others as well. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for this.
Very, very much, because it was a great pleasure for me to have this opportunity to share ideas and to discuss with you. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm very grateful for this occasion to discuss, and I hope that we will have the pleasure of meeting in person in the future, and I'm wishing you all the best.
Likewise, and thank you everybody who has come.
Yeah, thank you very, very much also for the question, and I'm very, very grateful.
Have a good evening.
Same to you. Bye.